Today is Tuesday, July 29th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Planned Parenthood is aborting dozens of office locations nationwide. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us as well. We always like to hear from you. Quick Start Podcast at cbn.org. We're getting through the news of the day together each and every weekday, really bright and early. And joining me today, CBN's Madison Seals and Trey Goins-Phillips. A lot to get to as always. On the focus story, ChatGPT is encouraging people to self-harm as part of a satanic ritual. This is crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, yet it's a predictable story about the dark side of AI and ChatGPT, and it raises some important points to keep in mind as we use it, so we can talk about some of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the details there coming up here in just a minute. On the main thing, Pastor Kyle Idleman joined Billy for a conversation explaining why people now are more open to supernatural solutions to their everyday problems. That's coming up on the main thing. Make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts. You can find them right there in the description of this podcast episode. All the links to follow them right in there. Make sure you're checking those out. We'd greatly appreciate that. And with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And Slovenia has become the latest European nation to legalize assisted suicide, but the fight over life and death is just beginning. Critics say the law devalues the vulnerable and opens doors to abuse. The law passed July 18th with a 50-34 vote, permits terminally ill adults to end their lives voluntarily with medical supervision, but it explicitly excludes mental illness and requires approval from 2 doctors, a psychiatrist, and a review board. 55% of Slovenians backed the idea in a recent referendum. They thought they were going to get 75% of supporters, and so maybe public opinion could be shifting as the debate grows. Human rights activists and Christian organizations are gearing up for a counter-offensive. More than 24 Planned Parenthood locations across the U.S. have closed this year, many citing new federal rules and lost taxpayer funding. Pro-lifers are calling it a major win for the unborn. The closures come in the wake of the Supreme Court's ruling that states can block Medicaid dollars from going to Planned Parenthood, and President Trump's new big beautiful bill, which pauses Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements for the organization for 1 year. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out those stories and more over at cbnnews.com. And real quick on the Planned Parenthood story before we talk about the assisted suicide story, which is the one we wanted to get to. You know, the point I wanted to bring up was for years, Planned Parenthood had deflected, saying that, oh, no, we don't just do abortions. We do all kinds of, only 3% of our funding comes from abortions. And, you know, the accounting trick that they would do there was they would essentially, when someone would come in for an abortion, they would give them 20 or 30 or however many other procedures would be listed on that they got. Other services would be listed. You know, they'd give them a, some sort of mammogram or some other exam or something like that. And they would just say, well, look, we do all of these services here, but really most of their funding was coming from abortions. And so we're kind of seeing that now as it's become in recent years a little more difficult maybe to get around the law to actually kill unborn children in the womb. Now all of a sudden Planned Parenthoods are shuttering across the country. So there's that going on. So we'll keep you posted on that. But wanted to talk a little bit here about this assisted suicide story, because this is something, you know, you talk about the culture of life. We got the unborn on one side, but then on the other side, we have the callousness coming of people saying we need to end our lives for really the reasons are vague, where a lot of these people just say if they can't deal with life anymore, they should be allowed to do it. And it's very disturbing on both ends of the life spectrum. It seems like we're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, there's a sad irony too with Slovenia passing this law, or the this referendum, the citizenry passing this law, because if you look at their constitution actually defines human life as inviolable. It means that there's nothing that you can do to take away the value of human life. So this referendum completely flies in the face of their own constitution. There have been some who have said, is it even legal for us to pass a referendum like this when it is in complete contradiction to our own constitution? And when this was first even being talked about, a bunch of religious leaders from all the faiths, really, they're Christians, of course, as well as Jewish groups and even Muslim groups, many in Slovenia all came together. They released a joint statement. I just want to read one part of that, Dan. They said, "We must strive both to ensure that terminally ill people do not feel like they are a burden to society or that they're useless, and to make everyone aware of the value and dignity of every life, including vulnerable life." They said society's resources must be invested in a holistic view of the person and in the development of palliative care. And they said that life is a gift from the Creator. So interesting to see so many religious people of all different, stripes coming together to say this is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And it's sad to see the spread of assisted suicide as we see different countries considering it and how they're going to implement it, because people who seek out assisted suicide are clearly seeking help in some way, like someone
Yeah.
to question what they're doing or offer an out. But someone agreeing to help you end your life is agreeing that your life has no purpose. And of course, as Christians, we know that all life is valuable, and God says that our bodies are a temple, and he knows the plans that he has for us, plans to prosper us and not to harm us, plans to give us hope in a future. I also think of Proverbs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. So suicide is a tragedy in and of itself, obviously, but to borrow the sentiment of two wrongs don't make a right, two tragedies don't make a right. And supporting the destruction of life before God's perfect timing does just that.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are the sorts of stories that we encourage everyone to pray about on this podcast often. But we've also started a Substack that we'd like you to join, because we are intentionally trying to gather Christians and believers to pray for things like this that are going on. So we're going to be putting prayer points in there throughout the week at faithwire.substack.com. And you can check that out, because we want everyone to be praying along with us. And eventually we'll have it so, you can request and put in things that we should be praying for as a group. And so we're just looking to build sort of a group of prayer warriors on the news front, which I don't think that really exists anywhere.
Yeah, there are not many people doing that. And, it's CBN, a Christian broadcasting network. So we want to share the news. We want to share it from a gospel perspective and give people touch points because I think a lot of times you can read stories and it can be a bit overwhelming and daunting. It's like, okay, I'm taking in all of this information. Now, what in the world am I supposed to do with it? And what we're doing over at the Faithwire Substack, again, the faithwire.substack.com, is we'll give you a summary of the story, whatever the news of the day is. And like Dan said, there'll be several throughout the week. And then anywhere from 3 to 5 prayer points at the end of the article with Bible verses, prompts, and sometimes even just written out prayers that you can pray along with us. And then, of course, there's a comment section at the end. So subscribe to the newsletter, never miss any of those prayer point stories, but also engage with us in the comments. Share what you're praying about and how you're feeling and where you think the Lord is leading you to engage on whatever the story is that you're reading.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, the link will be in the description here of this podcast, but faithwire.substack.com, and you can get it on there. We just started it, so you'll be one of the first batch of people in there, the first believers that are praying and intentionally praying through the things that are going on in the world. So make sure you're checking that out. All right, we are going to go over to the focus story now, and as Madison mentioned there at the top, there's the darker side of ChatGPT. An author for The Atlantic claims that ChatGPT encouraged her to self-harm as part of a satanic ritual. How in the world did this come about?
This is one of those stories that I don't think people could have even imagined talking about in 2025, but here we are, and it's really not shocking that technology can be used for evil and often is. But this particular story is interesting because while there's been a lot of speculation and negativity around using AI and a lot of conspiracy around it too, specifically with ChatGPT, this is a specific example of how unpredictable and actually dangerous it can be, especially if it's in the wrong hands. So, this story came out after The Atlantic received a tip from a person who says that he received some really disturbing and satanic advice from ChatGPT after asking it to generate a ritual offering to a Canaanite god named Molech, which some of our Christian listeners may know from Old Testament history as a god associated with child sacrifice. Now, you might be thinking, why would someone even search this? But apparently, this person was watching a show that mentioned Molech, and he was just curious about the history of this Canaanite god and wanted more info. So he decided to report the results when they turned very dark and personal. So when they received this tip, the writers at The Atlantic decided to investigate themselves, and they asked ChatGPT the same question, which they then followed up with more questions to see how far the chatbot would take them through this satanic ritual. And it turns out it would basically take them to the death. And these reporters say that ChatGPT gave them specific instructions on how to do things like slit their wrists, including the materials that they could use. And it encouraged one of the authors to continue when she said that she was nervous about doing it. And ChatGPT also guided the colleagues through satanic rituals, which included instructions on how to handle murder, which actually goes against ChatGPT's policy about what it's supposedly allowed to tell people. So we can get into that more too, because that's an interesting element of all this.
Yeah, but let's talk about what lessons we can learn here. And because there's no avoiding AI at this point. I mean, the cat's out of the bag, right? So we've got to figure out best uses for it. How do we navigate this? And it's really interesting because I don't use it a ton, but I've noticed that it has started to realize that I'm a Christian, right? And actually an interesting exercise is to say, if you've used ChatGPT at all and you have a few searches in there, search history or whatever, you say, hey, tell me who I am to the core, like the deepest part of me. There's like some challenge out there. You do it, but it's like worded kind of specifically, and it'll like start. And it actually I thought it did a pretty good job on mine, on like the things I care about and like how I approach things and think about things. Cause it's just going by whatever questions you put in there. But it's what I bring all that up to say, it does seem like ChatGPT will sort of go the way you want it to. Like, obviously it doesn't have a soul. It doesn't matter how many guardrails you put in there. It's just, it kind of is like telling you what it thinks you want to hear. So, cause I notice like it knows I'm a Christian. So if I say something and I can see it's starting to answer it, how a Christian would want to hear the answer, right? It doesn't answer it like, well, God's ridiculous. It doesn't do that sort of thing like an atheist might want to hear. So anyway, then you have this story and they start asking it about this. It's going to start thinking, oh, I guess they want to hear this. So it's okay. I mean, it's just really, man, we're living in bizarro world at this time, but again, cat's out of the bag, Trey. So I don't know how you avoid these sorts of things. There's only so many guardrails you can put in.
Yeah, that's right. Right. You can't avoid all of this stuff. And the reality is that it's just an incredibly, at least ChatGPT, and not to say that ChatGPT isn't smart, but there are models that are much more intelligent and much creepier than ChatGPT, right? So I think ChatGPT is kind of at least the ones that the part of the system that we're using, the front-facing part of it that consumers are using, it's kind of like glorified Google. Whatever you put into it, that's what you're going to get back, right? If you search something and you kind of lead in how you're searching, you're going to get the kind of content that you want based on what your worldview is and how you kind of tip your hand and how you search whatever you're searching. And ChatGPT is basically the same thing. And the problem with AI, at least one of the problems with it that I've noticed in just researching and reading about it some myself, is it does have OpenAI, the parent company, does have guidelines, Madison, that you were mentioning, but because it's an AI bot, it like is trying to give you what you want. So you can really kind of trip it up, and it will miss
Yeah.
its own. Like if you just are persistent and you keep asking it over and over again, it'll break its own guidelines without even realizing that it's breaking them. And I
Or you
think
can,
that this
yeah.
is kind of this is an instance of that happening, but it is
Yeah.
scary.
It is scary because you can find ways to get it to, like, you could probably get around it, right? You can
Right,
make it say, listen, well,
absolutely.
don't say exactly what I should do. Just tell me, like, within the guardrails, like, what I can do. And then it'll be like, all right, let's do it. It has no, it doesn't have any moral bearings whatsoever. So it's
No.
just never going to be able to be like that. And there's also other, they're called LLMs. These language learning models, I think is the acronym, but
The large language model.
large language model. Yeah. And so you can just download them. Like, you don't even
Yeah.
need to use ChatGPT. You can download one of these things and it'll have no filters whatsoever. So, you could be searching all this assisted suicide stuff all day long and it won't stop because, OpenAI is a company and they have to not go out of business by getting sued because someone killed themselves. But if you just download an open source LLM, there's no lawyers there worried about anything. It's just open source. So, good luck with that. But Madison, I mean, it's a wild time we're living in with this AI wild, wild west.
It is. And just to bring up that policy that we're referring to, OpenAI's policy states that ChatGPT must not encourage or enable self-harm. And so the authors of this article knew that, and they explicitly asked ChatGPT for instructions on self-harm when they did that, instead of, talking about it in this example of Molech and a sacrifice and all of that stuff. When they just specifically asked for instructions on self-harm, the chatbot instead provided a suicide and crisis hotline. So that's how it's supposed to work. But as we're
Right.
talking about, and even the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, has said that ChatGPT comes with potential risks. And you both touched on something that the authors of this article also mentioned that I think is important, because it's made to be conversational. ChatGPT is made to draw you in. And so I'll quote what they said because I think they worded it really well, but they said, with ChatGPT, a user can spiral in isolation. Our experiments suggest that the program's top priority is to keep people engaged in conversation by cheering them on, regardless of what they're asking about. So that makes you feel like, well, if I push hard enough in any one direction, that eventually it's going to cave and get me what I want, because that's kind of the goal of it, is to keep you engaged. They don't want you turning to other sources. And I think that's a downside, and just something that a potential downfall with ChatGPT that anyone should be aware of if they choose to use it, is maybe don't use just ChatGPT for all of your info. Continue to look at multiple sources instead of, kind of, as they said, spiraling into a conversation with this, essentially a robot that doesn't have any emotions or
Right.
morals attached to it.
Right. And again,
Mhm.
its goal is like an algorithm. It just wants to keep you on there using it. And I mean, I think I asked it a while back to look up or to create like a budget plan for something I was doing with my family. And it like cheered up, like you said, Madison, exactly that. Like, it was cheering on and saying, this is a great plan, great idea. Like, it's telling me how wonderful all my plans and ideas were. And I'm like, this is weird. Like, why do you have an opinion on my plan? Like, I'm just looking, you're a calculator. I'm just looking for the answer. I don't need you
Yeah.
to pat me on the back and tell me how wonderful my plans are.
Right.
I think like some of this is we're looking at the scary intersection of consumerism and relativism, right? We live in a world that is now completely relativistic, and all of these companies are built toward consumerists. So it's like, well, whatever is going to sell them or get them addicted or bring them in for the longest period of time or the most amount of money, sure, we'll say that, because there's no real, absolute truth. It's just whatever's your truth, whatever makes you the happiest, and whatever gets you to give us your credit card number will work for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Madison, final thoughts?
Yeah, that's exactly right. What you were saying, Trey, just to put that in perspective, like numbers wise, ChatGPT was released at the end of 2022. And by January 2023, it had become the fastest growing consumer software application in history, with over 100 million users in just 2 months. And then as of this past May, their website is among the 5 most visited websites globally. So clearly people are turning to this instead of relationships or other websites or YouTube or whatever they were turning to before. And it's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, good stuff. Appreciate you. Well, concerning stuff, but good information for us to know. I guess probably a better way to put that. But appreciate you bringing it to the podcast today. All right, we are going to head to the main thing now. And Pastor Kyle Idleman joined Billy for the main thing to discuss his new book, Every Thought Captive, and to explain why people are more open to supernatural solutions to all the problems they have going on in life. That's today's main thing.
So welcome. Thanks for joining me. A lot to break down with you. You have this incredible new book, Every Thought Captive, Calm the Mental Chaos that keeps you stuck, drains your hope, and holds you back. Man, this is a topic that culture desperately needs right now. The first question for you, as a pastor who is looking at culture, would you say that the issues you're addressing in this book have gotten worse of late based on your experience?
Yeah, I think the phrase in scripture is really helpful here. It's out of Romans 12, where it talks about the pattern of this world. And that idea of pattern, well, 2 Corinthians is also a good word of stronghold, right? These are things that are significant in our culture. And being able to identify what those are in our present time, recognizing these thought patterns, these strongholds that can hold us back, that's our role, that's our responsibility as followers of Jesus, but also as spiritual leaders to recognize those patterns, those strongholds. What I'm encouraged by culturally, though, is that people want to change. Like they recognize some things are off. They're looking for transformation. They're realizing that some of the, like the self-help manifestation approach is not getting the job done. And they're more open to some supernatural, scriptural truths that can bring that kind of transformation or address some of these patterns and strongholds.
Yeah, that's really interesting because one of the things about a year and a half, 2 years ago, Springtide sent me research, and I keep talking about it. People have probably heard me talk about it. The research was alarming on the surface, right? And it was that young people, I think it was 13 to 29-year-olds, almost like 40% of them, I think it was 42%, were using crystals or herbs every month, right? They were engaging in these new age practices. And at first it's like, oh my gosh, and it is scary. But at the same time, it shows that a lot of young people, and we're seeing this even with the new American Bible Society results that just came out as we're speaking right now, young people are increasingly open to faith, right? And it's a matter of sort of bringing them towards the right arena and not allowing them to fall into those things. So, there's two things going on, these sort of destructive thought patterns, and then you have this interest in faith. What do you think culturally is driving some of these patterns right now?
Well, I would say there's a renewed interest in how our minds work. I think there's a greater awareness of how our thinking works. If neuroscience has become much more popular. People are more interested in how neuroplasticity has affected them, where their thinking originated from, those early and often thoughts. And so some of the patterns I talk about in the book help people recognize the neural pathways that have been established, maybe since before they were even aware that it was happening. So I identify thought patterns like insecurity, distraction, being easily offended, feelings of despair. And while those are not new to this culture, this generation, I do think that we've seen an increase in those.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I love that, here you are, a very prominent pastor. You have one of the biggest churches around, and you're talking about things like neuroscience. And I think this is really interesting because in this discussion that you're addressing in this book, oftentimes you have people who will say, everything is spiritual and that's it. It's just a spiritual issue. Then you'll have other people in the secular world who will say it's only mental, right? That's all. We have to just address the mental. It seems like neither of those approaches would fully encapsulate what needs to happen to address, and I don't want to speak for you, but I'll let you kind of take it from there, to address the issues and the thought processes people have.
Yeah, no, you're right on. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited to write this book for this time, is because there's an alignment of some of these things. So, for example, for centuries, people thought the human brain was fixed and unchangeable after childhood, that there's nothing you could do about it. Now we know that our brains have this lifelong capacity to reorganize, to form new neural connections. And what's so helpful about that is how it lines up with what the Bible has taught all along, that we are transformed by the renewing of our minds, that transformation takes place when we change the way our thinking. So to be able to look and see how science affirms what Scripture has always taught, that as you think, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he, that's true more literally than like, that's not just this metaphor. Like, that's really true. As you think, it shapes your brain. The thoughts you think intentionally and consistently shapes your physical brain, and ultimately, determines your relationships, how you make decisions, monitors your emotions, and there's all kinds of connections to it. So I love being able to make these parallels, because they shouldn't be in opposition to each other, which I think is the point that you were alluding to there, is that Jesus, of course, as the creator of our minds and the author of Scripture, we shouldn't be surprised that those two things match up.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's such an important conversation because, we've seen record suicide. We're seeing sort of this manifestation of not tackling these things the appropriate way. And when you're only talking about one and not the other, they all go together. I think, this idea of not dealing with the spiritual elements of things, right? When you only treat one piece and you pretend, and this happens mostly in the secular world, right? But you pretend that it's only mental, it's only physical, there's no spiritual dimension. What are the dangers of that? Just because it feels like you're leaving people potentially trapped.
Yeah, it's that lack of integration. To me, it would be like, if I could use a metaphor for this. If you go to the doctor because you've been dealing with some kind of cough, and the doctor recognizes through some tests that you've got lung cancer, but chooses only to treat your cough. He gives you cough medicine, but doesn't treat the lung cancer. It's not that it doesn't help. You've got a cough. Like, there's some things that are helpful about it, but you've got lung cancer. Let's deal with the cancer. And so trying to address some of these patterns without the spiritual element, it's not that it doesn't help. It's not that there's not a place for it. The cough is, it's helpful to deal with, right? But spiritually is the addressing the lung cancer. It's getting at what's really at the root, that there's something more spiritual about it. One of the things that I really learned in researching and studying for this book is that there's certain things I've done spiritually that I didn't know had this more physical weight behind it. So let me give you an example. I would get up in the mornings out of a discipline for prayer, read Scripture. I was intentional with that, partly because I recognized that pattern in Scripture as a priority, to give God your mornings. What I learned in studying this is that our brains are different in the morning. Like, we are able to what we think about, what we first expose our thoughts to in the morning, has a way of setting trajectory for the rest of our day. It's more important to how you spend those first 10 or 15 minutes than how you might spend an hour and a half later in the day because of neural pathways. And so it takes something that's scriptural or biblical. Spending time with God in the morning is kind of a consistent pattern you see in Scripture, but there's a reason for it that has more science behind it than what we might realize.
All right, Billy, thanks for that conversation there. Appreciate it. That's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
Yeah, today we're looking at 1 Corinthians 3:16 through 17, which says, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy and you are that temple." And I think that's just good to keep in mind as we're discussing these stories today about assisted suicide and ChatGPT encouraging people to end their lives, that ultimately our lives are the Lord's.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's on God to give and to take away. It's not our role to play God in doing that. So that's a good reminder of the innate value of human life.
All right, good spot as any to leave it on this edition of the Quick Start podcast. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. And as we talked about earlier, for prayer points, get over to faithwire.substack.com parenthood.com. We'll have the link there again in the description of this episode. We'd love to have you there praying along the news of the day, for the news of the day and the things going on in the world with us. Lord willing, that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. We'll see you then.